everyone. Welcome to this evening's lecture in the 2024 Follow the River Lecture Series, hosted by the Hudson River Maritime Museum and sponsored by Rondout Savings Bank. I'm Carla Lesh, the museum's archivist. I'd like to thank and acknowledge my colleague Leslie Drojak, intrepid museum volunteer, for all her help this evening getting you all checked in, and museum educator Jack Loesch, who is handling the technology and set up the yummy snacks. Before we begin, can I please ask you to turn off your cell phones? Thank you. Some logistical information. Please note that the restrooms are located in that hallway. And please take note of the multiple ways to exit the building. Hudson River Maritime Museum is a 501c3 not-for-profit. We do not receive funds from the city, state, or federal government except for periodic and competitive project-based grants. We thank Rondout Savings Bank for their sponsorship of the lecture series. We also thank you for your contributions that help support the museum. Please note that we are video recording this lecture and presentation to be posted publicly on our YouTube channel. The question and answer portion at the conclusion of our speakers' remarks will be included in the video recording, but it's my understanding that the audience is not in the recording.
For the Q&A.
Oh, okay. We include the following water and land acknowledgement in our public programming. The Hudson River Maritime Museum is located on the Rondout Creek, part of Lenape-Hoking, traditional home of the Lenape. We recognize the painful history of forced removal, dispossession, cultural suppression, and genocide of the indigenous peoples. By collaborating with present-day Lenape communities, culture bearers, and scholars, we are actively working to improve our exhibits, public programming, and educational resources, and help everyone better understand this important history. This is our second to the last lecture of the season. The last lecture will be on October 30th. A Year in the Life of an Orchard will be presented by Kevin Clark, lead orchardist at Rose Hill Farm in Red Hook. And tonight's lecture, A Geology and History of the Rosendale Natural Cement Industry, is presented by Professor Steven Schimmrich. In 1825, during the building of the Delaware and Hudson, D&H Canal, from the coal fields of Pennsylvania to the Hudson River at Rondout, it was discovered that a local rock unit could be used to manufacture a high-quality natural cement. Thus began the Rosendale natural cement industry, which lasted up until the last mine closed in Rosendale in 1970. By the late 19th century, the Rosendale cement district supplied over 50% of U.S. production and was used in such iconic structures as the Brooklyn Bridge, the Statue of Liberty, and the U.S. Capitol. Today, only abandoned quarries, mines, and kilns mark the locations of this once thriving industry. Professor Schimmrich has been a professor of geology at SUNY Ulster County Community College for 25 years and is the author of Geology of the Hudson Valley, A Billion Years of History. His specific research interests are in the geology of the local area and the interplay between geology and the historical development of the region. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Can you see that? Is there a way to turn the lights down maybe a little bit? Maybe. Looks a little glary to me from here. Okay, oh, that's a little better, right? Okay, so I'll try to sort of stand still because it's being recorded. Normally, when I'm teaching, I'm walking all over the place. But so let's talk about natural cement. So people have used different kinds of cement. Going back to ancient times, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the ancient Romans building aqueducts, and even locally with stone houses here in Kingston, people have been using natural cement. And they've used a variety of different natural cements. Some of them, like in ancient Babylonia and Egypt, you don't have to worry so much about the rain weathering it as much as you do maybe here, right? And so different types of materials have been used over time. But I'm going to concentrate on natural cement in our local area. And so a reasonable question is, how do you make natural cement, right? So you need a rock with the right composition. And geologically, we call those rocks limestone or dolostone. You've probably heard of limestone, maybe not dolostone. But limestone is made of a mineral called calcite, calcium carbonate there, CaCO3. And dolostone, you add some magnesium into it, right? And the addition of magnesium actually makes it a harder, more resistant rock. But that's geologically generally what natural cement is made of. You drive around Kingston, those white rocks you see on the side of the road, those are basically limestone. Then you need to cook the rock. You need to put it in a kiln and heat it for a while. And maybe a couple of days even to burn it. And what you're doing is you're breaking down that CO3 in a formula into CO2, which is carbon dioxide gas, which goes up into the air, obviously. As a matter of fact, making cement in our modern era is one of the biggest contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which of course is a greenhouse gas. It's an industry that generates a lot of CO2. Then you take that cooked rock and you crush it. You turn it into powder. Pretty straightforward. And you add water and it goes back to rock essentially, right? That's a simplistic kind of explanation of how to make natural cement. The reality is you can take graduate level courses in cement chemistry. There are textbooks of cement chemistry. It gets very complex in today's day and age. There are all kinds of things added to modern cement for giving it various properties that it'll set under cold conditions or wet conditions or other things. But this basically for natural cement, this is all it is. You find the right rock, you cook it, you crush it, you're good to go, right? So our story starts with canals. So in the early 1800s, there were no railroads really. And so how do you transport stuff? You know, there's a limit to what you could put in a cart, a wagon drawn by horses. And so over in Europe and here in the US, we started building canals. And the famous one, of course, being the Erie Canal across New York State there. And our story, well, let me just mention before I say that, here's just an Erie Canal lock upstate. And note that you have, when you build these locks to change the water level so the canal boats can, go up and down with the elevation changes, you need to hold those rocks together with something, right? So you need cement. And there was a natural cement industry in the early 1800s, Chittenango near Syracuse. The rocks were the right composition that they could be cooked, crushed, and make natural cement. Well, then a group of investors said, let's build a canal from the coal fields of Pennsylvania, where they were mining high-quality anthracite coal, to bring to places like New York City. And you might think, well, maybe a direct route, just due east, right? But no, if you've ever been to Pennsylvania, there's all these mountains in the way, and it gets difficult to transport that material. And again, remember, this is before railroads. And so these private investors came up with the idea of building a canal, the Delaware and Hudson Canal, which first proposed in 1823. And as you can see, it operated throughout the 1800s there, and about 108 miles, 108 locks. Well, when you build locks, like this one here in High Falls nearby, you need cement. And they were originally planning to import the cement all the way from Syracuse to ship it on the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River, and inland to get to where they were building the canal. And that costs money, obviously, right? So they started looking in the local area for rocks that had the right composition for natural cement locally. And lo and behold, they found in High Falls some rocks, and there's some discrepancies about exactly when it was discovered and by who, but around 1825, probably by a D&H Canal engineer at the time. And these engineers who worked on the D&H Canal, they worked previously on the Erie Canal. There's a famous historical sign in High Falls about who discovered it and when. But Bill Merchant, if anyone knows him, who is works at the D&H Canal Museum in High Falls, he thinks that's wrong. But sometimes the historical signs aren't completely accurate. But however it worked, they found cement locally. These guys who were investing in the canal, this was a private enterprise. This wasn't the government building it. It was a group of investors. They had to be popping champagne that night because they just saved a lot of money. The cement was right along the path of the canal. They didn't have to ship it from Syracuse, right? And so this became what's called the Rosendale Natural Cement District, and stretches basically from High Falls here, only a few miles wide, about 12 miles up to Kingston, along the Rondout there, sort of northeast, southwest. That's a belt of rocks which just happened to have the right composition to make natural cement. And so, as I'm a geologist, I can't help talking about the geology a little bit. These are some of my students looking at rocks. So again, limestone is this rock made of the mineral calcite. It's a sedimentary rock. Limestone tends to form on warm seafloors. And it forms because a bunch of marine creatures make shells and coral reefs and things out of calcite. They have special tissues that pull those elements, calcium and carbonate ions, right from seawater and secrete hard calcite. And so little coral polyps that are just a few millimeters long, they create these big coral reefs. And when you look at things like today, clams and oysters and scallops, those shells are all basically built out of calcite. And there were marine creatures going back hundreds of millions of years that developed this ability. When these guys die, the shells and coral break down and eventually form what's called carbonate mud. And over time, that gets buried and turned into basically limestone. Under some conditions, you have a little more magnesium and you get what's called dolostone. And dolostone's very similar to limestones, limestone with some magnesium, but the magnesium bonds more tightly to the carbonate ion and it makes a harder rock. It's a more resistant rock. And locally, it tends to be sort of an orangey brown color, whereas the limestone's more whitish to gray. And there's a rock unit, geologists call it the Rondout Formation because it's found in the Rondout Valley. And there are three members of this rock unit. And the lowest one is called the Rosendale Dolostone. It's a dolostone layer that's found in Rosendale, obviously. There's a middle layer of limestone called the Glasgow Limestone, named again locally, and the Whiteport Dolostone, after a sort of a town that doesn't exist anymore, but down around Rosendale area. And so it turns out that the two dolostone units make a great natural cement. They have the exact right composition. They're dolostone. They actually have some clay in them that add some iron and aluminum and other elements. And it turns out that if you take these dolostones and you break them up and cook them in a kiln and then crush it into powder, you have natural cement. You don't need to add anything, and it's pretty straightforward. The Glasgow limestone, not so much. It doesn't make a good natural cement. So in the old literature, sometimes they call this the lower cement and the upper cement. And the middle ledge is what they called the limestone. I've even seen reference to it as the bastard limestone. So these old miners, they have their own terms for things. So let's talk a little bit about geologic history. This is something that I'm particularly interested in, the history of the area. And if you were to get in a time machine and go back 450 million years, right? MA stands for mega annum, million years ago. It's a period geologists call the late Ordovician period. First of all, this area would be underwater, be fairly deep. It'd be a fairly deep marine basin, and there'd be volcanoes erupting, volcanic islands. It would be like the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska, a chain of volcanic islands. And the reason for this is because of plate tectonics. There was ocean crust sliding down under ocean crust here, called subduction. And when it slides down, it melts and it forms magma that comes up and forms this chain of volcanic islands. Big earthquakes going on here too. We know there were volcanic islands here during this time because down at the floor of this marine basin was clay settling out of the water, and that clay has layers of volcanic ash in it. You go all along the Hudson River here, those black rocks right along the river, a lot of shales and sandstones, they formed in this marine basin. And there are layers of volcanic ash in there that can be radioactively dated, even better, to give the age. And then eventually these volcanic islands collided with proto-North America. North America was a little smaller then, and thrust up mountains called the Tectonic Mountains. Not those little hills we see east of us today. These were Rocky Mountain-sized mountains. If you go back to that period of time, life was just starting to come out on land. There were it was barren. That's why I like this picture I grabbed from somewhere of like the Himalaya, showing there's no plants here. That's what it would have been like. Erosion would have been a lot faster. Lots of pebbles and cobbles, fist-sized pieces of rock and sand washing down off these mountains. And so streams coming off these mountains full of sediment, pebbles, sand. Today, we see it as a Shawangunk conglomerate. That white rock up by Mohonk and Minnewaska down to Sam's Point and so forth, that white pebbly rock are pebbles that eroded off those ancient Tectonic mountains, right? There's a picture of me up in Minnewaska or wherever. And then these mountains eroded away. I have students do an exercise in class where we say, we get real erosion rates calculated in places like the Andes and the Himalayan mountains. And it's just tiny, 1,000 years, a few millimeters of erosion. But you multiply that by hundreds of millions of years, you can erode away entire mountain belts multiple times in these periods of time. So by about 420 million years ago, those Tectonic mountains were mostly gone, the original mountains. And this area started to be inundated by seawater and shallow, muddy tidal flats. And that's the Rondout Formation. You can actually find mud cracks in the Rondout Formation where this mud was drying out as the tide goes out, it's baked in the sun and so forth. And those dolostone were deposited in a very saline environment, not a lot of fossils here. The limestone, the Glasgow limestone in between was when sea level got a little higher and you had lots of marine organisms. The Glasgow limestone has a lot of marine fossils in it, coral and other things. But the dolostones don't have much because it was more of a hypersaline kind of environment. And you'll see why in a minute. And then the oceans started rising in this area and we were under a shallow marine sea. And how do we know that? I could take you right up to 209, right on the side of the road, limestone, full of fossils, marine fossils, right? So I always tell students, ask me why I'm saying this. Like they just write things down. I can say anything, right? But it's like, I can prove it. Let's go look at the rocks, right? And why was stuff hypersaline? Why was there warm tropical water here? Because New York, that red dot, is where we were, and that was south of the equator, about 30 degrees latitude south. That was a subtropical climate zone. And North America looked very different. There's outlines here of the states, modern outline to kind of show where things are. But this is these are the remnants of the Tectonic mountains. Here's the shallow sea just starting to come in. That was called the Helderberg Sea. All those limestones that we see in the Hudson Valley are called the Helderberg group because of that and so forth. And this is, a reproduction of what the seafloor might have looked like. But we find fossils of these things in the sea, in these rocks today. And then there was a big collision of a microcontinent that thrust up mountains again. And these mountains were actually Himalayan sized. They were called the Akkadian Mountains. This is 100 million years after the Taconic Mountains formed. They were about 450 million years ago. These are about 350 million years ago. And why is that important? Because those limestones, the Rondout Formation, it all got folded and faulted. This is a big fault. This is actually up in, this one's up in Catskill, but it's the same rocks you see here in Kingston. But this line here, that's a major fault that was thrust up during that collision. You could drive on Route 23 out of Catskill, heading towards the Catskill Mountains there, and you see rocks on the side of the road that look like this. They're folded. How do you fold a rock? I hand you a rock, you're not going to fold it, right? It's going to break maybe if you bend it, put enough stress on it. These rocks folded because by that point they were buried fairly deeply, and that collision crunched everything together, and these rocks folded, they broke and faulted, and you can see faults literally a quarter mile up the road on the side of 9W here. And folds. Just look at the rocks on the side of the road, they're folded. Why is that important? Because when you mine these layers for natural cement, your mines aren't nice and flat. Your mines have to follow the folds of the rock. And so some of these mines are flat, some are tilted, some are vertical. All right. So I bored you with the geology now. So let's talk about the Rosendale cement specifically. Let's talk about cement mining. So some of the mines in the area where they were getting the Rondout Formation, some are quarries. They just dug a big pit, a hole in the ground, because the rock unit was close to the surface. This quarry is behind what used to be the High Falls Motel in High Falls. And it's a nice, pretty lake now, but this was a big quarry. It was an industrial site. Here's another quarry nearby in High Falls. This is just, there's private property. There's a couple of houses around it. Nice, pretty quarry. This one is along the rail trail just outside of Rosendale, heading south on the rail trail a little bit. Again, another abandoned limestone quarry, or dolostone quarry in this case. Here's another quarry. If you know Rosendale, this is across the street from St. Peter's Church. And this is a colleague of mine, Karen Helgers, who was a professor at Ulster for a long time. She just recently retired. But this is a major fault that she's measuring there. You can see sort of scratches on it. That's because that rock moved. But all of this in here was quarried away back during the old mining days. And then if the stuff wasn't too close to the surface, what you have to do, you had to go underground to get it. And so here's just an opening to one of the mines. And throughout the Rosendale Cement District, from High Falls to Rosendale, basically like along between, say, 32 and Rondout Creek, all the way up to Rondout here, all the way up to Hasbrook Park and so forth. That's all, there are lots of these abandoned cement mines, most of which are on private property and not really accessible. So here's just a diagram from a publication showing the High Falls Shale, Biddingwater Sandstone, or other rock units. Then you had the Rosendale member, that's the Rondout Formation that you mined, the dolostone. Then the Glasgow limestone that nobody wanted. And then the Whiteport dolostone, which was mined for natural cement. Above the manliest limestone is another limestone that's not good for natural cement. But a lot of these mines ended up being sort of double-decker mines because they wanted specific units. And back then, they were doing it by hand. You weren't going to mine that limestone unless you had to, right? That's a lot of work. It's not like today where you have just big excavators to do this. They were doing this by hand. So a lot of these mines are double-decker in some areas. Also, the type of mining here is called room and pillar mining because you see the pillars left behind. Why do you leave pillars? So the roof doesn't fall on your head, right? And so a number of the immigrants who worked in these mines came from Europe, where they had worked in other kinds of mines, slate mines and coal mines and such. And they didn't really do scientific engineering studies like we do today. And it wasn't OSHA to make sure it was all safe. You know, these guys didn't wear hard hats or steel-toed boots. And so there were some accidents, but you know, it was mostly seat of the pants and experience that they knew how many pillars to leave in some areas. And they were pretty good on a lot of this. These mines have held up quite well. So here's an example of a double-decker mine. This is now a rail trail just north of Rosendale. And so you can bicycle right past this or walk right past this. But you can see it's a double-decker mine. That's the Glasgow limestone. They mine the Rosendale member. They mine the Whiteport member there. Right? And this just shows that. And so notice it also, it's not horizontal because these rocks are folded. So you have to follow the rock layer. Here's another example of one near Rosendale, the bottom and then the middle layer and then mining out the top as well. This is an old photo from about the 1920s. I'll just mention it that I have a reference to it later. But Princeton University used to send geology professors and students to Rosendale every summer to study the geology in Rosendale because the cement mines were all open and available and they could learn a lot. And some of these old publications, I have photocopies of them. They have these photos from the 1920s and early 30s, which are great. Here's another example of double-decker mining. In some places, they took out the middle layer there. You can see on the right. This is Joppenberg Mountain in Rosendale, and that's a Rosendale trestle, right? This is when they were actively mining. You may be like, well, I've been there. I don't see those open mines anymore because it was, I think, New Year's. I wrote a little article about it for the Century House Historical Society, but it was like New Year's Eve, 1899. The miners heard cracks and booms, and they wisely left the mine, and the whole front face collapsed. So no one was killed, but that's why it doesn't look like that anymore. So let's look at the inside of some mines. Here's me going into a mine. And here's some pictures. I'll go through some of these fairly quickly, but these are pictures inside the room and pillar cement mines. And flooding, you can see here, because during mining, they would pump the water out. But after you stop mining and you stop pumping, it just fills up with groundwater to whatever the water table level is. Right? And so many of these mines, this mine is actually the Widow Jane mine in Rosendale, which you can publicly visit. But most of this mine is underwater because it tilts downward as it goes along and it starts to hit the water table and then it's completely submerged. So here's just to give you the scale of these mines. You could drive a pickup truck around in some of these mines. They're pretty large. You see the person there for scale. Another picture. Note how this one's, you know, relatively horizontal. And same here. You can see even old tire tracks and stuff in this mine. And then it starts to get a little more tilted with different mines because the rock layers are tilted. And here's another. They tend to fill with mist and things at times of high humidity. And here, even more tilted, right? Starts to get a little more difficult to climb down into some of these. And even more tilted. Some of these aren't my picture. I have credit there. This one's vertical. The pillars are sideways because it's a vertical slot because these rock units have been tilted vertically. This is at the old Williams Lake property in Binnywater. And here's another example. Basically, it's vertical and I'm walking on a pillar there. There's some interesting features in some of these mines. There's flow stone, like you might even find in caves, where groundwater seeping through the rock picks up and dissolves calcite. And then it comes into the open area of the mine and it precipitates it out as calcite, the mineral. And so you have these calcite coatings, little even stalactites starting to form there, right? This is called rimstone and cave pearls when they're found in natural caves, but you see the same kind of thing forming. Those are little pebbles just coated with calcite. This is actually a fault surface. When rock faults and moves, oftentimes later, groundwater flows through there and precipitates calcite. And that calcite gets scratched with increasing movement of the fault. And you can see geologists always put something for scale. I usually use my black Swiss Army knife for scale. But you see those scratches there, and that's a fault surface. There's part missing here. The rock is missing, but that's the actual surface of a fault. And it's on the floor of the mine. This is kind of a neat feature. This is me and colleague geologist. But this was like in I think like February, little ice stalactites were forming. This is East Kingston, just down the road here. And kind of cool how these ice stalactites were forming in the mine. Not geological, but just pretty cool to see. A lot of old machinery left in some of these mines, all very rusty and decrepit. Lots of graffiti and such, but from kids going in. But this is part of a ventilation system that was in one of the mines. Here's some old electrical stuff that's no longer connected to anything, old boilers and things like that. And this is ductwork for ventilation back when it was operational. And of course, lots and lots of graffiti and broken beer bottles and other things in these mines. So they're a little spooky. I never go in them by myself. I've dragged my wife, God bless her, into some of these mines. But I've gone in with other people as well. And, it's a little spooky when you have just a headlamp and maybe a flashlight. And these are pretty big and they're dark and there's funny noises and drips and, so forth. And, but just a couple of other random pictures of me in a mine checking things out. But some of them are hazardous. These guys were pretty good at what they did. They put the pillars in appropriate places. You could see places where there were a lot of fractures in the ceiling. They put more pillars. Where the rock was more folded, they put more pillars. So most of these mines are pretty good. Most of the problems are at the entrance, because at the entrance of the mine, you get freezing and thawing, because water gets in. You see all those fractures, water gets in those fractures. And we have lots of days where it gets cold at night and the water freezes and it warms up during the day and the water thaws. Well, as you know, if you ever left a water bottle in your freezer, ice expands, right? And so over time, the freezing and thawing tends to break down the rock. This is a column, a pillar at the opening of a mine in Rosendale, and it's just sketchy. I wouldn't hang out a long time under something like that, right? In some of the mines, they still have wooden timbers. Some of these are probably approaching 150 years old, and they're still there. Why did they put those there? To hold up the ceiling. They're still there, still holding up the ceiling. But obviously they've been there a very long time under wet, damp conditions. So God knows what kind of shape they're in. There are holes filled with water. You'd have to be pretty careless to fall into something like that. But that water is about 50 degrees. You don't want to fall into that. And this is kind of cool because this is in a mine in the upper Whiteport member. And presumably there's a whole nother mine below this, but it's underwater. So unless you had scuba gear and you had a death wish, cave diving is like one of the most dangerous things you can do. People have tried diving in the Widow Jane mine and in other mines. In one case, I think it was back in the late 60s. I have a newspaper article from it, New York Times on it. Some guy died in Binney Water back then, scuba diving one of the mines. A rock fell on him. It was unstable. And I've heard stories from people who've done more recently, and they're like, you just move a little bit and stirs up all the silt. You have zero visibility. Inside the water, too, there are things like cables and old machinery. And if you're scuba diving and something like that, you don't want to tangle up and stuff like that. Notice there's like little slabs of rock on the floor of the mine. Where do you think that came from? Ceiling of the mine, right? It's just spalling off. And especially the upper Whiteport member, because the unit above it is called the manliest limestone. It's very finely layered and it tends to spall off very easily. In some cases, you get big rocks that have fallen off the ceiling, right? And this next picture is East Kingston, where the front face of the mine a few years ago, I think it's 2019, just collapsed one morning, right? And I talked to the geologist up there. It's the property is owned by Canal Industries, and they built a wall there and cut a lot of the trees. But that whole front face, there was a mine there, and kids used to go up in there and play in there and all that from East Kingston. But July 25th, it just collapsed, and like overnight. So you got to be careful in some of these. So now some of the history. I just have a lot of random pictures of history. I've gotten them from all different sources, and I just think a lot of them are just kind of cool. It's kind of neat to see the miners, you know, and kids worked on these cement mining plants. I mean, and all men usually, and mostly immigrants who did not have other skills. The work was backbreaking. It was all manual labor, right? And the highest paid, most skilled workers were the people the kiln master who regulated the burning of the kilns was one of the highest paid members of the crew, and also people who did any blasting. Originally, when this mining started, it was before dynamite. It was black powder, and then later dynamite was invented. But it, most of it was just by hand, maybe some mules to pull things. Again, these are just some random pictures of people, some of the miners. No hard hats, no steel-toed boots, no special protection for hearing and eye protection and all of that. So certainly people were getting hurt. This is in supposedly the Widow Jane mine in Rosendale. And here's another picture. Note wagons pulled by mules, most likely, right? And the same thing here. Wagons. And this is the base of the kilns, which we'll talk more about in a minute, with a little roof over it. But again, those mine carts and things were basically a lot of horsepower basically used there. And there's people here. It's a little hard to see them over there, just to give you an idea of the scale of the opening there. And as it went into the 1900s, the industry started to fall back. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you started to get some more power tools and things run by steam, and compressed air and things like that. Some electrical lights here. So I don't know the exact date of this picture, but obviously more recent than these earlier pictures back here, right? And then even toward the end, the last mine closed in 1970 in Rosendale, and they had much more modern equipment, obviously, at the end. But you can see this is inside the mine, and these mines were pretty sizable. So once you mine the rock, you have to bring it to a kiln to burn the material, right? So you mine it, you break it into manageable pieces. So you're breaking the pieces, like that to bring to the kiln. And so most mines had some system of rail to take the mine carts up to the kilns. This is Joppenberg Mountain in Rosendale, which I showed a picture of earlier near the Rosendale Trestle. And you can see the tracks coming out of that and some mine cars there. All of this gone, today. And here's the top of the kilns. So they would bring it to the top of the kilns, and these guys would dump it in there. And I'll talk more about the kilns in a minute. Here's a track. This is still here in Rosendale off the rail trail south of Rosendale. And this comes out of a lake. It comes out of a quarry. So what's on there? I have no idea. When you try to do research on this, there are no mine maps. There's very little way in the way of documentation. So a lot of these mines, you have no real idea how big they were. Other than this one had to be really sizable because they have a whole bank of kilns there, and which means they were pulling a lot of rock out of here. This is near Rosendale Century House Historical Society. There's still some remnants of things laying in the woods if you look around, you know, random pieces of metal and supports for the old rail systems and things. That's about all that's left in most places. So the kilns. Kilns are where you would burn the rock to make your cement. And so there are banks of kilns right down the road here, you drive down Creek Locks Road toward Rosendale. In Rosendale, you have a bunch of kilns, even in High Falls. And so these are where you would burn the rock. You dump it in the top of the kiln, and it comes out at the bottom. And I'll show you the process here in a minute. Just a couple of pictures of kilns. This is Binneywater Road, which is now a parking lot for the rail trail. And this is up by the old Williams Lake property. And this is down in Rosendale, Willow Park, I think Willow Kiln Park or whatever, behind the movie theater there in Rosendale. And this is down the road here. So what do the kilns look like inside? Basically, they're an opening at the top. I have some pictures, and it comes down at the bottom where the material comes out. And what they would do is they would, as soon as the canal thawed in the spring, because they would ship the material on the D&H Canal, as soon as the canal thawed so that they could start shipping the material, they'd start packing rock and then originally charcoal, later coal. Once the canal was operating, bring coal from Pennsylvania. That was, you know, it was a great synergy between that, bringing the coal, and then you could use that to make the cement. And the cement had been made to make the canal. So it worked out well. So a layer of cement rock, coal, cement rock, coal, cement rock, and then they'd light it. And it would take a couple days for the rock to burn all the way down to the bottom. And the kiln master would control the burning of the kiln. And that kiln would burn all summer into fall, into, you know, probably November when the canal froze up. And it would be constantly running. And if you undercook the rock, it doesn't make good cement. If you overcook the rock, it gets glassy. And there's piles of this glassy slag all over the place near these cement plants. Usually now they're just hills with trees on them. You wouldn't even know. But if you dig into them, you start pulling out this overburnt cement rock that they just threw up to the side. But here's a picture. This is the top of the kiln. That guy's standing on a huge packed kiln with material. Probably not on fire yet because he's standing on it. But that would be the top of the kiln where they dump the raw material in. Here's the top of a kiln today. This is in the woods outside of Rosendale. And you don't want to fall into these. No, there's no fence or anything around here. You know, you could fall into one of these. And they're fairly, you know, it's a ways down. And another picture down into a kiln. And here's some of these kilns are falling apart. So you get a nice cross section, a nice side view. And this is in Rosendale here. And this is, you can tell that it's lined with a fire brick, and then the rock was built up around it to build the kiln structure. And here's another picture of a falling down kiln. These are very, very dangerous. These rocks are not stable at all. I would not go near any of these too close. And this is me pointing out the kiln over in Rosendale here. See that bit of a wooden frame left there? These had roofs on the front of them, like shed roofs, because when you pulled out the material on the bottom out of here, you didn't want it to get wet and rained on, because then it would harden again. You know, that's not good. Here's the bottom of a kiln, and this is a student, former student, and this is where they would scrape it out. And what I've heard is that in some of these cement plants, they had kids. That's what kids would do. They would work there scraping that stuff out into a wheelbarrow and taking it to where it gets milled and crushed. Here's a picture of some old wheelbarrows there in Rosendale. And I was going to say something. I kind of lost my train of thought there. But, imagine working here on a day like today. This kiln's been burning since March, right? Imagine the heat coming off of these things and going here and just working at these kilns. It had to be pretty horrendous kind of job. Here's the bottom of a kiln that just has a grate over it with some burnt cement rock behind it. This is in Rosendale. And here's a picture from back in the day of the bottom of a kiln and the wheelbarrow here and pulling this stuff out. And here's what it looked like when it was operational, the bottom of the kilns. We don't have those wooden shed roofs anymore. They've long been rotted away and taken away. But many times there was a building attached to this as well, where they would mill the rock and break it down, right? And so you'd come out of the kilns and pull the stuff out and bring it over to get crushed. And so grinding and packaging, these are grinding machines here, and you put the rock in the top, and they had various types of crackers, as they were called, these just steel rotating gear-like things that would just break up the rock. They also used millstones, Shawngum conglomerate millstones, locally made millstones, mostly from like Accord area, and to finally grind some of this stuff. So they would break it into smaller pieces and then grind it into a fine cement powder, like you might be familiar with today. So I've seen, again, pictures of these places. These guys were breathing cement dust all day long. You know, you see pictures of these things, and you see just coatings of cement dust everywhere. None of these guys wearing any masks or anything. Originally, they put these in barrels. Originally, the cement plants had coopers on site who made barrels from saplings, and they would put it into barrels, and then later they started using paper bags like we're familiar with today. And these are some guys just working. Notice no face masks or anything. And they surely had lung problems when they got older. And this is just a picture of a cooperage where they were making barrels at the time. And here's a picture of right outside this window, probably, of one of the canal boats coming into the Rondout here with, you see all the barrels of cement on it. And then later they moved to bags. And there are a bunch of different bags that you can collect from the different companies and iterations of companies that have existed in the Rosendale cement industry. Silos around in some areas where they stored the natural cement. There's still silos up in Rosendale. There used to be some in what's now Sojourner Truth Park up here, but they ripped them down. I actually have some pictures here. This one is from those silos that existed there. But now they're gone. That you don't want stuff like this around when people are walking around. Before it was private property, so don't tell anyone else here. Some of these pictures, yeah, it's easier to get forgiveness when you're caught than to get permission sometimes. These are the silos up in Rosendale above the Century House Historical Society. This is private property. It's owned by Iron Mountain up there. But it's people are up there. There's graffiti all over things. Here's what it looked like in the heyday, back when it was an operational cement plant up there. This is one of the last operating cement plants. This is the one that closed the last. So we have these nice aerial photographs of the property, some of which show cars. If I knew cars, I could probably figure out what year it was. So some pictures of some of the cement plants locally. This is 1872, an actual photo of Lawrenceville down by Rosendale, the cement works there. And there's some old postcards and things and illustrations from different publications showing some of these old plants. What always gets me too is there's no trees on these hills. They cut everything down, right? And today everything's forested again. But back then it was all bare, and you know they were grazing animals like sheep and things, and polluting the air. But you know, it was a major industry. And here's another picture of East Kingston here. If I could read, Hudson Cement Works. I think that's down by Eddyville there. And here's another one of New York Rosendale Cement Lyman Cement Company, which is East Kingston here. And some more So kind of neat to see some of these. And you still have some historical records of things from advertisements, selling cement. Sometimes some of the Century House Historical Society has a number of documents of varying things. So you can see how much the cement was selling for and who they were selling it to. But mostly it's material from the mid 1900s, even not going back into the 1800s for the most part. There are some 1800s maps of cement plants, and they were fire insurance maps. So these are preserved in what's called Sanborn publication of these maps. These are online. If you Google them, you can actually, all this has been digitized. So a few things about modern cement, which you may be familiar with. You know, I just recently am building a deck, so I went to Lowe's and I bought some concrete mix and cement and concrete. Cement is just the pure material coming out here. You mix sand in, you mix gravel in, you get concrete. It's stronger, it sets better. It's generally what you use for building things. Cement itself usually isn't strong enough to hold up well. But in 1893, the late 1800s, most of the cement in the United States came from the Rosendale Cement District. It was a huge industry. There were a lot of different factories, plants. It's very confusing when you try to research this because, like any industry today, they get bought up and consolidated, become some consolidated cement company, which they buy up the smaller ones, and then they change their names because it gets sold and it's a different name, same cement plant, you know, so it can be a little confusing. But these guys were putting out a couple of million, almost 3 million barrels of cement a year here, right? That's a lot of cement. By the 1840s, there were 13 companies with 16 cement works, 600,000 barrels a year, right? By the late 1800s, 50% or more of US cement. This cement went all over the place. It didn't just get to the Hudson here and go down to New York City, where it built basically most of New York City that you see today is built of Rosendale cement. But it went to the U.S. Army had a contract with Rosendale cement. A lot of forts that were built in the mid 1800s, including a fort called Fort Jefferson off the Florida Keys and the Dry Tortugas, was built with Rosendale cement. There are buildings in the Midwest that were built with Rosendale cement. A lot of things, right? By 1899, 92, or 29, excuse me, I'm dyslexic there, cement plants, but 5,000 men working, right? And in the 20th century, it tended to die off. Why? Because of the invention of what's called Portland cement. Portland cement, it was named after a building stone called Portland stone. It has nothing to do with Portland, the city. But it was discovered that if you took any limestone, basically you add what's missing. So the natural cement, the rock had just the right composition. You didn't have to add anything. But they figured out eventually that if you take any limestone, chemically analyze it, you add some sand, you add some clay, sometimes you add some coal ash and other things, you can get the right composition for natural cement. And that's called Portland cement. Made mining cement much more easy because there's lots of limestone. Natural cement rock is more rare. And you have to mine it where it is, right? But limestone, it's all over the place. So looking at natural cement versus Portland cement, by around 1900, Portland cement just took off and natural cement just kind of dwindled away. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, you know, well, I'll hold off on that for 1 second. I mean, I may have a slide about it. So the last gasp, 1970, the last one closed in Rosendale here. Just, I don't know if anyone can date those cars. This is a little earlier than that. But the major plant here in Rosendale. Today, cement factories are a little more high tech, right? This is a control room of Lehigh Cement. You look at some of the cement plants like up the Hudson River further along the river there. They're mining regular limestone. They chemically analyze it. They add what's missing. They analyze the product, you know, in real time, and they create a very consistent product. So when you buy a bag of concrete mix cement, you can look up all of the strength characteristics of that. And that's what engineers need when they design buildings and bridges and dams and all of that. They need to know all of those, how much force can it take, compressive or pulling apart. And so natural cement varies. It's actually very strong and very durable because there's stuff made of Rosendale natural cement, railway bridges and things that are locally. The abutments are made of Rosendale cement and they're just fine. They're still holding up after well over 100 years. But it's a little inconsistent from batch to batch and from mine to mine. And sometimes they would mix different products from different mines to try to make it more consistent. But in today's world, you need, a very consistent engineered product. So natural cement has kind of fallen by the wayside. But a lot of iconic structures were built with Rosendale cement. The Brooklyn Bridge there. As a matter of fact, the gates of the Century House Historical Society are designed to mimic the shape of the Brooklyn Bridge. The base of the Statue of Liberty is Rosendale cement. The bottom of the Washington Monument, they halted construction during Civil War time there, but the lower part, which you can see the line there, this is Rosendale cement. The top part was not. Croton Aqueduct, the dry dock, Navy Yard, Brooklyn, and even forts as far as Fort Jefferson and the Dry Tortugas, and a lot of other Civil War era kind of forts along the East Coast were built with Rosendale cement. As a matter of fact, this picture here with the scaffolding, there was a company, Edison Coatings, that got a contract to do restoration work here. And they analyzed modern cement. They analyzed the Rosendale cement there. And they determined that Rosendale cement stood up to the pretty extreme environment here, a lot of salt water, salt air, high humidity. So they actually got they went in some of the mines and got the rock and remade Rosendale cement and used it in their restoration. And they sell small amounts of it for restoration, historical work. And they call it a boutique cement. A lot more expensive probably than those bags from Lowe's. And the New York State Thruway, large part of the New York State Thruway was built with Rosendale cement. And really much of New York City, right? Because once it got on the Hudson here, where does it go? It goes downriver, right? So some adaptive uses of these mines. This is a picture of those Princeton geologists I mentioned earlier, 1920s into the 30s. They would come up here every summer, and they would write these publications and had photos of these guys out there. And, I dress like a slob. These guys wore like 3-piece suits out in the field. I never understood these field geologists in the summer with a jacket and a tie and, okay. Now these guys here, these are Princeton geologists, some of whom are quite famous in the geological, community, history of geology. And this is some of the illustrations they have, where they went out with their students and they taught the students how to identify the different rock layers. They have beautiful color illustrations of some areas. This is from 1923 from the publication where, this is part of Joppenberg Mountain, actually, Rosendale. These are great to look at today, and especially some of these old photos. It's neat to see these old photos and then say, where was this? Let's go find, its exact place. They don't look quite the same anymore often. And today they're used for teach. I bring students to the Widow Jane mine all the time. As a matter of fact, tomorrow I'm bringing a group of students down there for my geology class. SUNY New Paltz brings them, and other schools, Vassar and so forth, brings students to these cement mines. I led a professional field trip for Geological Society of America to some of these mines, and just public programs and things. So educationally, they're still being used even 100 years later. They're important for bats, as bat hibernacula for the bats that hibernate over the winter, rather than the ones that migrate. There's one type of bat called a little brown bat. These mines used to have a lot more bats in them, But a while ago now, I think it's like a decade ago, there was something called white nose fungus. It started killing all the bats. And in some cases, almost 100% mortality in some of these bat hibernacula. That white stuff on their snouts is a fungal infection that ends up killing the bats. And these are some pictures from the DEC of bat mortality in some of these mines, which is unfortunate. So they're even more important now to sort of stay out of some of these mines in the winter to help these bats recover. There were other adaptive uses for these mines over the years. Mushroom growing was a big industry back in the 1960s. I've heard that if you had a can of Campbell's mushroom soup in the 1960s, those mushrooms came from Rosendale, from a cement mine, right? Or from East Kingston here, right down the road. And they had these my father actually, I grew up in this area. My father worked in one of these in Rosendale, is still growing mushrooms when he was a teenager. And he said they had big wooden trays, and they had cow manure, horse manure that they grew the mushrooms on. And they used to throw manure at each other for fun. But yeah, they grew tons of mushrooms. And there was a Herman Naust who owned the mine right down the road, walking distance from here, was called the Mushroom King. And these mushrooms were pretty popular. And then for whatever reason, the whole industry sort of moved to Pennsylvania at one point. But you can see Naust's Cavern. That's right down the road. These mines are today important for groundwater. These mines are flooded. They have groundwater. One of the things that geologists talk about is karst topography. It's topography, a landscape where the limestone is dissolved away underground. So you have a lot of caves and things. And we have some of that here. We have a few caves in the area. There's one right down the road. There's a spring down the road there. Mary's well there, and where people are always collecting water. And the thing about that, normally when water seeps through the ground, it's not flowing in open passages. It's seeping through pore space, microscopic pore space. And it's moving just a couple of centimeters a day. It's pretty slow. And it has a chance to basically get clean because there are bacteria in the ground that sort of clean up the water. And so, you know, I have a well in my backyard. I drink groundwater. It's important that it's not polluted. The problem with caves and mines, by extension, is that water flows through them really quickly. So if that water gets polluted, it stays polluted and ends up somewhere else quickly as polluted water. And so that's important because some of these mines, they're building things over top, putting in septic systems and other things. And if this water gets contaminated, it can contaminate a much larger area than if it was just regular groundwater, so to speak. So that can become an issue. There's actually been some studies of that. The Kingston mine right down the road, a colleague of mine, Paul Rubin, who's a geologist who does a company called HydroQuest, he was looking at water flow there based on, and this is a while ago now, this figure's old, but he does more recent work. But basically how the water in the mine responds to rain. And, you know, this water gets in the mine really quickly and affects water levels. The water's a resource too. Turco Brothers in Rosendale, they have these big trucks. They use the water from the mine to bring to construction sites, fill swimming pools, things like that. It's a big industry for them. Widow Jane whiskey, if you've ever heard of Widow Jane whiskey. They claim it's from the Widow Jane mine. It's not. The Widow Jane mine is on the Century House historical site. And there was a lot of confusion when this first came out because people were thinking that the historical site, which is a nonprofit, was selling whiskey and making a ton of money. No, they weren't getting a penny out of it. So it's actually Turco Brothers water. You read the advertising for Widow Jane, it's like, oh, this pure water from the pristine mine. It comes from a mine that's full of like frogs and bugs, and you know, it's not something you would never drink that water just like that. But you know, it's advertising. Iron Mountain in Rosendale, Binneywater Road. I actually worked there for one summer. It was like one of the worst jobs I ever had, but it was because you went underground. They started like 7 o'clock in the morning and it was summer and you were just underground all day. But they actually drove trucks down there. They had 2-story buildings down there. And back when I worked there, tell you how long ago it was, they had reel-to-reel computer tapes that they filed there. And they had couriers. Every day they would take these tapes and go down to New York City. And they go to Chase Manhattan Bank and these big investment houses. These were the backup tapes for the New York City financial district, basically, in case of nuclear war, disaster, fire, whatever. And so every day we'd get a printout. Oh, we pull these tapes. We go in the tape library and pull them, put them in boxes. And then every day new tapes would come in. You put them back on these racks. And it's big lucrative business. So nowadays, I don't think they need those big reels of computer tapes anymore. You probably put it all in a little thumb drive. But, just 2-story buildings down there. And not the best place to work during the day in the summer when you're young. And this is Andrew J. Snyder. He was the owner of what's now the Century House Historical Society. He was the owner of that cement mine there. And he used to ride around town in Rosendale into the, I think, the 1970s on his horse and carriage. There's still a carriage collection up there at the Century House Historical Society. So he's quite the character. He had a pair of Dalmatians too. He would ride around with. But they actually had for a while where Iron Mountain is. They had like a little hotel down there, which was for big shots during nuclear holocaust. They've kind of let it go, so I don't think it's used anymore. But the idea was the plans there, and you could see, I don't know if you want to spend the nuclear holocaust with bankers from New York City or something, but they had a nuclear bunker there at one point. You could tell from the furniture there on the upper right there, that couch fabric, it's not modern. And then development. There's a lot of development going on some of these old cement properties. This one's been going on a long time. I'm not even sure if it's called Canopy anymore because it's been going on over a decade now. But the old Williams Lake property, which used to be a resort hotel, small family-run resort hotel in Binnywater near Rosendale. And after the owner retired and such, they bought the property, this big development firm, and they wanted to put luxury housing and golf courses and other things. And then the town fought back a little bit, and then they scaled it back, and they're still building there. But they had to worry about mines. There are mines all over this property. And when you develop, you don't want people, fancy developments falling into a hole in the ground. So
there's also an issue about karst.
Karst, yeah, sure. The water and the sewage, you build a large development there. What do you do with the sewage? Does it get into the groundwater then easily? There were concerns about, just pulling the water out of the lake, which was spring fed, but also probably connected to the system of water. And this was, Paul Rubin did a lot of studies there, who I mentioned earlier, who studied East Kingston here. And yeah, plus the other types of issues that come with a big development in a relatively small town. They were going to put a big development over here too, and I guess now it's Sojourner Truth State Park, which is a neat place if you walk around there. There's actually an old cement mine there that's kind of fenced off and buried in the woods. You can't really see too easily, but there's big lakes there that were cement quarries. There used to be big silos there as well that they've torn down. But it's a nice walk there, especially along the river. They have a paved trail there. But development or turning it into in this case a state park. I know what I prefer, but I'm just I like trees and stuff. And another adaptive use, the only mine you can visit now without getting permission from private property owners, who will most likely not give it, is the Widow Jane Mine, Century House Historical Society in Rosendale, the Andrew J. Snyder Estate. And they have concerts there all summer and plays and other things. Their most popular one is taiko drumming. I was on their board of trustees for about 10 years. So I used to see all of these. And taiko drumming is this Japanese drumming, and if you could imagine that in a mine with the echoes and really pretty impressive kind of shows there, various types of music and things. But you can just go there and wander into the mine. The site's open all the time, except in winter when you get a lot of ice there. And just a plug for the Century House Historical Society. This was Dietrich Werner was the person who bought the property. He died a while ago now, but he was a person who filed for the historical designation and so forth of that area. So well worth visiting. So, and that brings it to an end. So I'll put in a plug for my book. I've written a book on the geology of Hudson Valley. If any of the geology interests you, you can get it on Amazon, or you can get it at Rough Draft Books. They always carry it and sell a lot. And these are my students. He's a crazy professor. So happy to entertain any questions. I just need some water. Yeah.
So you mentioned the roof falling in and some of the things being in the table. How safe is the widow Jane mine?
It's informally inspected. I don't think they've ever really had a mining engineer come out and look at it, but a lot of geologists have been there and go there frequently. I think it's pretty stable. I don't worry about that one at all. I would most worry right at the entrance where you have dirt and stuff up above the entrance. But inside, it's rock solid in there. I've been in some real sketchy ones where, I'm just like, oh, if I die, I die. I'm in here. It's a risk you take. Yeah.
Have you ever made cement? Have you ever just crushed the rock and heated it up?
I haven't, but I've talked to the guy who works for Edison Coatings a number of years ago. We did a local conference on natural cement, and geologists from all over the place came. And he actually brought some of the raw stuff. I have some samples of the cement powder and stuff, but I haven't seen it made. I'm not that ambitious to try. So it'd probably take a lot of trial and error. Yeah. Question? Yeah.
Well, that will form the question, but when they sent these sacks of cement powder to various construction projects, was it a very simple, uniform, straightforward process from there for the people on the site to mix it with water? And
yeah, the natural cement was pretty straightforward. You just mix it with water, and they usually would then shovel some sand or some gravel into it to make a concrete mix, to make it a little stronger. And the ratio of sand or pebbles to cement is just their formulas for that. How many parts of this to how many parts of that, and how much water do you add? Yeah, the amount of water you add. If anyone's ever mixed cement, you can make it a little stiffer, you can make it more soupy. So modern cement is very different because there's even if you just go to Lowe's, like as a consumer, there's bags and bags of different types of cement and mortar mix and this and that. And for engineering construction purposes, even more. And they'll add fiberglass to it to make it stronger, or they'll add chemicals to make it set better, set faster, set slower, depending on what they're using it for. So there's different types of mixes that are used for different things. I'm not a mason, so I don't work with cement much. Mostly I just work with concrete to make simple things like a little pad for something. But there's different mixes for doing stucco cement versus making a pier for a deck, or versus doing other things. Yeah, and these guys by experience. Yeah. I mean, these are people who just worked with this stuff every day, and you learn by experience and by being an apprentice and working with people who did know.
Follow up with one thing, so that transitions into my question about this concrete. So when they went from cement to Rosendale cement to Portland cement, and then at some point, I mean today, construction was high, like.
Yeah, well, you can use just,
When did that transition happen?
oh, they were using it to make concrete way back. Yeah, I mean, the cement by itself is not very strong. It'll crack more easily, and you wouldn't use it for making thick. So you always add these binders in, like sand and pebbles and things like that.
And that is concrete.
Right, that would be a
Add
concrete
stuff
mix,
to the cement, then that
Yeah.
becomes concrete.
basically. Yeah, it's a whole. There's a whole science behind it now these days.
So for the Brooklyn Bridge and everything else, that was natural cement together with rocks.
Probably sand more than rock, but yeah, and you know the Rosendale cement was famous also and advertised as a hydraulic cement. It hardens underwater, and so that's what made it so useful for these bridge abutments and things and dams and so forth, because it would actually harden even underwater. And cement actually takes, you mix it, and like when I make something with cement, a couple hours later it's hard enough, right? But it doesn't reach its full strength for weeks to months even, because it starts absorbing, I guess, carbon dioxide directly from the air and getting setting. It actually takes a long time for it to reach its full hardness. So, that's why when they pour cement for things like bridges and things like that, they do it at stages and things like that.
You mentioned the Widow Jane Mine. How did it get its name?
The property was, there's no definitive answer, but the best that, what I've heard about from some of the historians who've looked into it is that the property was originally bought from the Widow Jane, whoever that was. Right. Yeah. So, probably an old farm at one point. Yeah.
You mentioned about 1970, the last.
That was sort of the last official closing of the company.
I mean, I can remember as a kid driving through East Kingston with my father and sticking your hand out and feeling the kilns. There were still something in operation.
Yeah.
Going on, probably right where Sojourner Truth.
Yeah.
Park is now.
Yeah, I don't know the exact dates that different companies
Right.
stopped working.
Yeah, I think it was on.
But it was kind of a gradual decline over the years. Different ones started going out of business, probably the smaller ones first, and again, the history of this is hard to research. I'm not a historian, I'm a geologist, but I do know some historians who've tried to research some of this, and there's not a lot of documentary evidence on a lot of this stuff, or some of it's just buried somewhere in like the Rosendale Library back room or something. They have some historical documents or things like that. Yeah.
AJ Snyder used to come pick me up with his buggy.
Oh, really? Okay. Did he have his Dalmatians with him? Yeah.
But he told me, and it was in the 70s, it was probably the early 70s, I used to have horses and ride off his property too. And he said to me, he's closing the mine, and he said he's outdated.
Yeah.
He can't keep up with what's out there.
Yeah.
And that's why, and it was a gradual, less workers over the years, and then it closed down.
Yeah, it was kind of a slow death to the industry, and he couldn't compete with these big, massive, modern cement plants that are able to operate today. So, it's neat. Yeah.
So, has Rosendale cement ever been compared to Norman cement in terms of durability?
Roman cement's made differently, so they use limestone. They mix it. For a long time, people weren't sure how they made it, and they eventually figured out they mix it with something, if I remember, pozzolana, which is volcanic rock from around Naples area. And that volcanic rock was mixed in with the cement, and that's what gave it its strength, because a lot of these old Roman aqueducts are still standing. And, they've been standing a couple thousand years. I mean, it's incredible. And, but they made a very durable cement, but it was a different kind of, they had different stuff in it. So, but for a long time, no one really knew the formula for making Roman cement. But with modern chemical analysis, I think they've kind of figured it out. But A lot of trial and error, I'm sure. It's amazing what people figured out old times, that today we had to rebuild from scratch or something. I don't want to take to figure some of this stuff out. It's just a lot of trial and error and necessity.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Stay and